Welcome, guys. Welcome to this Zoom chat. It's what we're doing nowadays. An old friend of ours, Gavin and I last week spoke to Jim Kays in New Zealand. We've got another Jim here today, Jim Tucker from Queensland, from Brisbane. Jim, welcome to our chat, mate.
Yeah, happy to be on board. I've had lots of times and great times in South Africa over the years, so more than happy to dive in.
I think what we're trying to, while we invited you on, is obviously to just chat about what's going on in your neck of the woods. We saw Super Rugby start in New Zealand last week, and we had a brief chat on Twitter there about some of the strange rules that's going to go into your neck of the woods when you guys start up in July. But maybe just take us up where you guys are in Australia at the moment in terms of returning to play.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're later than New Zealand. We're back on July the 3rd. We're a 5-team competition, so we've had the Western Force reintegrate into our competition. Obviously, no Jaguares and the Sunwolves sadly don't have another game to play. It was just too logistically hard to get them involved. So domestic competition, a sprint really, home and away, the 10 weeks, a couple of finals. So the interesting part is we're not sure in Australia if we'll have crowds at what point. I don't think it will be for the first weekend of matches, unlike New Zealand, where I think we all got a huge buzz out of seeing 43,000 absolutely excited people seeing a game of great footy between the Blues and the Hurricanes last weekend.
Yeah, well, how far advanced are the Australians in preparing for what will be a very sort of unique environment? I mean, going into stadiums, it may not be for the whole competition, but certainly for the first part of the competition, the guys are going to have to be, I would imagine, go through quite a lot of health testing before each game and isolation. I mean, how rigorous is it over there? Noting, of course, that you guys are in a very different situation to where we are. I mean, if we start to
very much so.
Carry on.
Yeah, I mean, at Ballymore, for example, there's a perimeter fence that's been put around the training venue. So any interviews from the media, we have to do that outside the fence. Basically, player inside, media outside. It really is keeping the distance is very significant. The social distancing, most of all. Now, Suncorp Stadium, that holds 52,500. So potentially at some point of Super Rugby, they can get maybe 10,000 in there, where with the inner bowl, the upper decks, all the separate areas, everyone would be distanced maybe a seat or two apart. I mean, that's not going to be that vibrant, humming, everyone on top of each other atmosphere, but it's a start, and then maybe get back to something more. So very rigorous, and very much, if there's a trip up, it trips up the whole competition and virtually stalls on the spot. So they have to be rigorous.
And are they doing putting measures in place such as bringing the two teams in at different entrances to the stadium? I know they're doing that. They were doing that in the Bundesliga at the start.
Yeah, in designated entrances with the heat monitors to regulate, to find out temperatures, all that stuff. That is standard practice now. And like just seeing training, at one point we've done the progression where you could only have 10 people in a group of training. So the Reds started with little pods of 10, so 9 players doing strength and conditioning with one coach. So you had pod A there, and then another half of the field, you had another group of 10. So it was really an odd sight because there was no contact training at that point either. So all little milestones ticked off. So the Reds are back in contact now. So it's really having pre-season all over again for a new season. So really weird times, but I think the relish of actually getting back into play has really fired up fans and also the players. They just want to get out and play.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jim, because we've been obviously reading a lot over the last sort of 3 months about Australian rugby for all the wrong reasons. The departure of Raylene Castle, all the boardroom sort of fights that have been going on there, and the pay cuts that have sort of almost decimated Australian Rugby Union staff there. I suppose in a way, the feeling is there that we just need to get back onto the field and at least have some rugby, just I suppose to take our attention away from that sort of thing in your neck of the woods.
Yeah, just to regenerate it, because most significantly, Australian rugby is just hemorrhaged money. So financially in a very deep hole. So the first thing was to get product back on TV screens so they could really just reactivate the current deal they have with Fox Sports to bring some income into the game. That was the most significant thing. So this domestic competition will bring the Fox Sports money this year. Next year is a whole different thing because we haven't signed a new 5-year deal, unlike South Africa and unlike New Zealand. They've all locked it away with Super Sport and whatever. Just in terms of the numbers missing from Rugby Australia, they chopped 47 jobs completely, 30 contractors gone. That's 5.5 million Australian dollars off the payroll per year, and they're calling that phase 1. So there's more to come on that front. So definitely trying to save big time money just to get through this period. And it spooks players as well. Players see this dysfunction at board level, and you know yourself, if you see that, players get itchy footed and go, okay, where am I more secure? And there has been a rush to the door by certain players wanting to secure their future because at the moment the pay cuts, the heavy pay cuts in Australia only go through to the end of September, but we all feel that some of the big contracts won't be honoured to their full dollar and cent value after that. So you have guys like Isaac Rodder, frontline Wallaby. He's got out of his contract at the Reds with 3 years to go, and he's looking for a job. We believe in potentially in Europe. 2 young kids, fantastic young products, Isaac Lucas, Harry Hockings. They're going to go to Japan just to have that security. Now bounce it into the Wallabies. They lost Rory Arnold and Adam Coleman, 2 very good and hardened test locks last year. Now you lose Isaac Rodder and you use one of the next wave, Harry Hockings. So Australia has really taken a knock in the lock stocks, and that's really the core of your pack, as you know, if you're going to stand up to the world champions. And we have to mention the world champions on this show. You've got to have some grunt in the Type 5, and really this COVID-19 crisis eats away, knocks around, erodes Australian rugby in so many different ways.
You mentioned the world champion nation. Of course, we are the world champions, but we're also a fellow Southern Hemisphere nation. Do you sometimes feel that because there's a very big danger of there being an imbalance in the sense that the North is going to get richer and richer, and there is a fear that we could just get poorer and poorer? Shouldn't there be some kind of intervention? We spoke to Jim about this last week as well. Some kind of intervention on the World Rugby's part. I mean, there's always talk about expansion. We must expand to Japan. We have expanded to now, but we must expand into Asia. We must expand all over the world. But at this time when coronavirus has caused so much damage to the strong nations, maybe we should be changing our sort of approach and looking at it as we need to make the strong stronger and work on the foundations, and there be some kind of intervention that will keep nations like Australia and New Zealand strong, and South Africa, of course.
Yeah, good point you make there. I think part of that is the thinking behind a much more streamlined world calendar, where you do get top nations playing each other more regularly. I myself, I think they've slightly got it wrong. I don't want to see every team playing every other team every year. Like you would say yourself, growing up in South Africa, the treat of playing the All Blacks was the fact they only turned up every 3 or 4 years. Absolutely. And then it was so special. And you knew year by year the tours. They came in this year, they came that year, we beat them that year, and now we have to wait to try it again. When you play them every year, it's sort of, even though it's great fare, it sort of becomes the norm too readily. So I think any streamlined rugby calendar to have these super competitions amongst the test nations, I would do every 2 years between World Cups. That'd be my suggestion. But that is where the money comes in, because mega broadcast rights, and that feeds South African Rugby Union, Australian Rugby Union, and the Kiwis, so they can put more money into their whatever it turns out to be Super Rugby. And that is a question mark, Gavin, what Super Rugby looks like next year.
I think, Jim, as well, I mean, from our point of view, we sit here in South Africa and we obviously read everything that comes out the other Sanzar nations. And it sometimes feels almost like, while it doesn't happen so often in New Zealand, it almost feels like Australia's got a bit of a problem with South Africa. If you look at the amount of comments by ex-players and wanting to dump South Africa and go with Asia and the Pacific route, etc., do you get that sense, or do you think it's just a couple of players shooting their mouths off, ex-players?
That is a good question. I think there's a degree of desperation in Australian rugby, that they're trying to find something that works in our market, and our market is different to the strongholds of the game in South Africa and New Zealand. Rugby union isn't the number one sport in Australia. Football code-wise, even, you've got rugby league and Australian rules football that are bigger than rugby. So to fight that battle, rugby's got to have a sort of a funky product, and people think it's Australia playing the New Zealand provinces, that they think that'll be a more appealing product. But you flip it over immediately, and why would New Zealand want to just play Australian sides and beat them every like 70% of the time? That doesn't lift their game. So it's quite insular in a way, the way Australia's looking at it, or certain people. But I think the commentary is really what's going to work going forward. I think everyone now agrees that Super Rugby going to 18 teams was a complete diabolical mess. Going to 3 conferences, bringing in new teams. And part of that was not having a strong central body who said, okay, for everything the Southern Kings are, South Africa can't have 6 teams. We're appeasing South Africa here. South Africa, you make a decision which team goes out. It's your call, but we're only having 5 South African teams. That call was never made, and it became a basket case after that.
Well, I suppose a similar argument in terms of when that happened, when the Southern Kings were thrown out and the Force came in, and all those sort of things. There should have been a lot better thought about that, because I think we all agree probably in this chat and probably around Super Rugby that Super 14 was probably the last time that we had really a great product. The travel factor. I mean, there's obvious issues with times. The Australian games, 11 o'clock in the morning, South Africa, 1 o'clock on a Saturday. When you've got rugby in the afternoon, it doesn't tend to play well with our audiences because people have got things to do on Saturdays. And same in your market. I mean, we sit playing at 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock, and that's in the middle of the night for you guys. So I mean, I can understand that whole argument there. It's just somehow you think somebody should have actually come up with a better idea, and it can't be the only ideas. I know none of us are at those sort of negotiations, but Super Rugby at its best has had some of the most amazing games out there. It just seems at times that there's too many bad games in between a couple of good games.
Are you guys both in agreement that the Super 12 was the best product?
I think so. Like, to me, how can you have a competition where, like, South Africa have borne the brunt of it? Like, how can South African teams go on a tour to the other side of the world for 4 weeks? It doesn't happen in any other competition. That is ridiculous. In the streamlined Super 12, you're away for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Happy days. Like, some of the best games, we talk about relevance, South Africa and Australian teams. Some of the best games I've seen in Super Rugby have been between teams from those countries. We went to one game at Newlands where Queensland Reds had a guy sent off in the first 5 minutes and racked up 40 points and beat the Stormers. It was a stunning game. And there's matches like that all the time. And I've seen some of the Bulls teams, when they won their titles, come over to South Africa, come over to New Zealand and Australia and beat teams on their home soil over there. And they were brilliant teams. Brian Habana and Matt Field, Bucky's Butter, like really high quality performances. And people really opened their eyes to a great teams from South Africa. But that was in a streamlined competition. So I think the the bosses at Sansa, and I call Andy Marinos the great invisible man of rugby, because he never sticks his head up. It's always to just every 6 months, like he needs to take some responsibility and just lead the show instead of being Mr. Reactive and basically just not putting his head up.
Well, I don't think you're the only one who probably calls him that. I think his time at SA Rugby was pretty much the same. So there's a general feeling about that. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, to me, more should be done to a partnership is only as good as its weakest link. And instead of trying to find new links to add on to the chain, we should, I think, and that was a point Gavin was trying to make earlier, is that we should be trying to make all the links, find the best solution for all our teams. And I think we all feel that way as well, because as you say, there are great games between the two. I remember a game that the Brumbies played at Loftus where they were 30 points up after like 25 minutes, and the Bulls stormed in that period when the Bulls won Super Rugby. They stormed back and won it by like 45-38 or something like that. And I mean, you get some really good games in between, but it sometimes feels like we just go through the motions week by week with the current system.
And we've got a history now. I mean, when you mention the Brumbies now, I don't know if Jim will remember this, but there was a time when Brumbies were coming to Cape Town, and there was always something going on the game. They've had some quite tempestuous games, the two teams. And of course, off the field, there were a few incidents.
Well,
I'm talking about
Quaid, the Quaid, James O'Connor, Quaid Curthy, those boys that tended to be
even before that, I'm thinking back to
the taxi driver incident in Cape Town. Yeah, that's it.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I think you were in the taxi, weren't you, with the burger spilled down the front? Yeah.
But there was a real sort of history that building up at that time, and I just sort of feel that, like, to throw all that away is a waste. I mean, that sounds like a weird thing to talk about, but you know what I'm saying. I mean, the history of if we were to sort of start without South Africa in a new competition, I'm talking about Australia. I mean, you're starting a whole new history, and I think that there's something to be said for that. I mean, I had the same conversation with somebody who was talking about South Africa going north, and I said, how long is it going to take before people can really relate to who Munster are compared to who Crusaders are, who we've been playing since 1996. In fact, before that, if you think about it, because there was also the Super 10 before that.
No, that's a very good point. I mean, it takes lots of years to build up those traditional rivalries. Like, you've been covering rugby for a long time, as Brendan has, and you have those classic matchups in your head. I was searching during the COVID cleanup, went through my old program collection in the garage, and there was a classic program from the 90s, Auckland Blues against the Queensland Reds. Front cover was Ben Tune, Jonah Lomu. I'm going to go and see that game. Even today, if you put the wonderful and late Jonah Lomu against Ben Tune, that's a matchup you pay your money and go and see. And I think sometimes people forget some of the flaws in Super Rugby are self-created. Beauden Barrett, who came back on the weekend with his new team at the Blues, he had not played Super Rugby to this point of the season. So after the World Cup, he was given a sabbatical for 6 or 7 games. So you tell me how you can flog Super Rugby as your greatest shop window in the Southern Hemisphere when potentially your best player is not playing. That's a joke. I think the Kiwis, we've let them come up with this formula saying, active rest periods, and they suck out their best All Blacks at the start of seasons, and we get back to Super 12 because it was a short sprint. Everyone played every game. Bang, you got your best players. That was part of the appeal. Now you've got this extended competition. Well, it's not that extended. It's only 16 games, but the All Blacks take players out. So we've created our own problems by hooking out the best players at the wrong times.
Well, you're 100% right there, Jim, because, I mean, one thing I've sort of picked up over the years is, as well, especially with the New Zealand teams, is how they tend to rest the All Blacks, especially before a trip to South Africa. And it's, as you spoke earlier about how our teams have to go for 4 weeks overseas. When you're going over for 2 weeks, it's quite easy to rest the guy. A Brodie Retallick, for instance, because he doesn't have to do all that travel. He's fresh when you get back and you're going into the sort of playoff rounds. Yeah, it's quite a nice way of doing it for them. A 2-week trip is quite easy.
Well, what actually happens is that we've seen it a lot, and just recently we saw it with the Jaguares as well, if I pronounced them correctly, where they would come to South Africa and they tended to target, if they were coming to South Africa and they were playing against the Stormers and the Sharks, they tended to target the Stormers game at Newlands for some reason, and then sometimes send an understrength team to Durban. And because I cover both, I'd be going to Durban the following week and see a completely different team playing against the Sharks, and in a completely different atmosphere as well, and possibly because of that, than what played in Cape Town the week before. And then you sort of wonder, well, you do start wondering about the integrity of the competition when that happens. And I remember a few years back, the Jaguars coming over here and playing, I think it was the Stormers that they played at full strength, and then they went to Durban with the second string team. And you can understand why they were doing it, because of their own travel factor, because they have a massive travel. Obviously, it's even worse than South Africa's.
Yeah, that's you make a good point there, and I think what it flows into is that our fans in rugby, they're not mugs. They see all that themselves, and they go, okay, well, I'm not seeing the top strength lineups. I'm not turning up. It's that fine, the flip now. You can watch it on TV, you can watch it in the pub, or catch half a game while you're doing something else, just having it in the background. So you've got to be convincing with your product, and all teams want winning combinations. That changes the flow of everything. Like the Queensland Reds have had some really down years over this last 15 years. But when they got it right in 2011, 2012, when they won it in 2011, they were getting 40,000 regularly to Suncorp Stadium in Brisbane. And for 2 games against the Crusaders that year, they sold out, like over 50,000 to Super Rugby games. So what that tells me over and over again, if you're successful, if you've got players that are humming, and I'll tell you straight away, Will Gagner, Quade Cooper played every game of that season, every regular season game, every playoff game. And they were the stars of that year. And the crowd latched onto them, and all the supporting cast after that.
I think the one thing, just let's go to Aotearoa rugby, if I said that right. This past weekend, we all watched. I think we were all quite happy at actually finally getting to watch a live game for a change. I saw quite a good chirp from a mate of ours, Craig Ray, who you know as well, Jip, who said all this debate on penalties, when the All Blacks have got away with murder at the breakdown for the last 20-odd years, it must be quite a new thing for them to be penalised for a change. So just get your take on that.
That's very good. Well, across the 2 games, 58 penalties. So your first reaction is to be aghast at that, but then you realise it's the same formula for every rule tweak rugby's ever had. Like the refs basically drum it into the players. Players realise they can't get away with what they've been getting away with at the breakdown, and a lot of the penalties were for holding on. And whatever. So that'll recalibrate in the next few weeks. I think personally, the really big law change, and it's not a law change, it's just a stricter and smarter interpretation, get people on side. We've also heard about this ridiculous last feet. That doesn't exist. It hasn't done for years. People use it as the starting point to sprint up like Usain Bolt and give attackers half a metre of room. So to see referees policing to make sure people are more obviously onside is fantastic. It naturally creates a bit more room, and we see more attacking rugby. You don't have to do anything much more than that.
Yeah, Gavin,
do you think that negates the rush defence?
Not so much that negates it, but it puts a little bit more. Makes it a bit more of a level playing field, I think. You'll still get the shrewd rush defences that, like a spot defender coming up, going for the outside centre, forcing a wide pass and different things. But yeah, perhaps it does take a bit of the heat out of the rush.
I thought was quite interesting from my point of view as well. I mean, Gavin and I had this chat about the rush defence on the weekend as well. But especially in that first game on Saturday was a lot of rolling mauls, probably because there was a lot of penalties and it's just easier to send to the sidelines. And then also those drop goals. And I still made a comment on Twitter saying that it's almost like watching South African rugby. People getting excited about rolling mauls and drop goals. And it's quite strange to see the Kiwis do that.
Well, good area there. I would say one of the rules that's being tried is essentially golden point. So you get to a draw and you just play on and the first score. So that brings back in a real rugby skill, which is the drop goal. So we all know how valuable the most vital drop goal in history of South African rugby was from Joel Stransky. And that snap where you can knock over a drop goal, it suddenly becomes a skill that you practice again. And I think that's exciting. That's going to be, you're not going to leave two teams deadlocked after 80 brutal minutes on the field to get a result.
I was going to say, there was another drop goal about 4 years later that you guys kind of enjoyed.
8 years later. Steve Larkham.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Then there was another one. Then there was another one 4 years after that. Johnny Wilkinson.
Yeah, I mean it's a brilliant skill. That Larkham field goal was the only one pretty much he'd ever kicked in his life, but he managed to do against the box at Twickenham. That was a crazy day.
Yeah. I was going to say,
it does underline the importance of that. Does underline I mean, how decisive a drop goal can be. Yeah. I mean, you look at that. So we just mentioned three off the top of our head. We just mentioned 3 World Cups where a drop goal was decisive. Okay, one it was in a semi-final, but the other 2 it was in a final.
Very true.
Yeah. I was going to say the other milestone, which I don't really want to. But I know Jim, you're also a bit of a cricket fan, so is today's that terrible day back in 99 with the World
99.
Cup. Yeah, that terrible day where the great questions of life that you get. So who shot JFK? Is there a Loch Ness monster? Why did Alan Donald not run? We still said there was still a terrible day in South African cricket. Yeah,
it's crazy. One of the things in our living rooms over this whole COVID-19 lockdown has been replaying famous sporting events over the last 20 years. They've gone into the archives, and sadly, that's been repeated a couple of times on Australian TV. That World Cup match against South Africa, like it's still quite incredible to see it because there's so much disbelief on the Australian faces. Like it'd be different if they thought, this is running our way, but that was like victory snatched from nowhere, really. Even to that last ball, you thought it's lost. The cause is lost, and I'm sure that's how you've agonised over it many times.
Yeah,
absolutely. Let's not talk about it.
Okay. No, I was unplayable that night. It was my wife's birthday, so I wasn't a very good husband that night. So
it's your wife's birthday today?
Yeah, it's her birthday today.
And you're spending it sitting on Zoom.
So the life of a rugby journalist, isn't it? So yeah. But I just also, you guys have got some rule tweaks in your side of the world as well. When you guys start up again, you guys going to have the 50-22 law and a couple of others. Have you guys got your heads around that?
Well, it's going to be tricky. One they're trialling is when the attacking player gets held over the try line. Rather than a 5-metre scrum, it'll be a drop out from the goal line. And I'm saying anywhere on the goal line. So you might get the little held up in the corner, 5 metres in from the touchline. Someone takes a drop out, maybe an angled one, and kicks it across the winger, and there's some crazy score from 95 metres out. That'd be unusual, but that's possible. Or just bang it downfield. What I guess it does is creates a little bit more broken field attack coming back at the try line over and over, rather than perhaps another set scrum. You look at the old footage, and I've done a bit of that, and I don't want to be a dinosaur. I love the position, the place of scrums in the game of rugby, but I hate the monotony of resets. I hate the time that's wasted. I hate props and locks going down as if suddenly they've been shot with an elephant gun, when all they want is a break and slow it down like NFL, and that's rubbish. That's got to be taken out of the game. Scrums have to be speeded up safely, and more of them have to be eliminated from the game. So we just have a scrum as a feature, but not so many resets.
Yeah, I mean, we quite enjoy that. The Springboks scrum pretty well in the World Cup. So I think the scrum contest, I think we all agree, should still be there. But there are ways you can.
100%, 100%.
So
yeah, just remove some mindless ones. Remove some mindless ones and speed them up a little bit, and then we can get all on board with them. I think it's seeing some of the moves you can pull off a good scrum where you go up on the tight head side and manipulate what you can do in the back line because you lock on the flankers onto a scrum. That's fantastic strategy, and we see some brilliant tries from it.
Also, I mean, we hear a lot, obviously, about we don't see as much NRL as you guys do. Yeah, and there's always a talk about when there's rule tweaks and that we're becoming closer to league and more like league, and trying to take rugby's features away. Just your point of view, do you see these moving closer to league? Because I mean, I suppose the proof's in the pudding, and there's always unintended consequences from any rule change that they don't think about.
You make a strong point there, and I think we had one story written in Australia this week that some of the rule tweaks that we put to World Rugby were straight from Rugby League, but World Rugby wasn't even aware they came from Rugby League, and that's sort of the golden point. And also being held up over the try line and having a line drop out, they're direct takes from Rugby League, and certain people at World Rugby didn't even know that they existed in the other code. So that's how much they noticed the other code. And really, Rugby League on the international scale is an insignificant. So if they've got something that can benefit rugby, go for it. I mean, we saw it most notably 20 years ago when teams started to borrow Rugby League defence coaches, and that changed the whole face of rugby. Australia first, then you had Les Kiss with Ireland, who was a Rugby League player in Australia, and it's gone through all the, obviously with English sides and Welsh sides, they've had Sean Edwards and Rugby League figures who've really changed the face of defence.
Yeah, is something you want to still chat about? Or
I was just going to ask, the one thing I wanted to know just about the 5-team league that you're going to be starting, Jim, and it's interesting to hear that they will have a final, because obviously the Kiwis don't have a final. The Western Force, I mean, we know the other four teams have been playing the last 2 years, and so we know what to expect there. But what's happened in Western Australia in the last couple of years, and what sort of what kind of competition will they put up?
Well, they are a great story. Like, we've all seen Super Rugby teams cut and they just wither on the vine, and that's the end of them, basically. So the Western Force, to stay alive, it's all been behind the backing of Twiggy Forrest, who's a mining magnate, and I put the word billionaire to his name, not millionaire. He has so much money, he could even buy your properties, Gavin, your portfolio. He has been bankrolling the Western Force, and they've played in their own competitions that he's created, like with Samoan teams, Fijian teams, Hong Kong, Asia. He's created a whole suite of matches the last 2 years to keep some rugby in Western Australia, which is a great feat in itself. They won the second tier National Rugby Championship last year, so they're a competitive side. They'll have a few players, a few add-ons for this competition. John O'Lance, who's played for Worcester, and he played in a Super Rugby winning side for the Reds back in 2011. A few players like that are coming into the Force, so they'll be the great underdogs. They'll be the 5th ranked team, but they'll spring a surprise somewhere. So a lot of public sentiment behind them.
Sounds good. Yeah, I mean,
carry on, Brendan.
Yeah, so I was going to say the Falker, the old Eastern Transvaal in South Africa, they were involved with that Malaysian side as well, and because they're a non-franchise team, so they were kind of hoping that would go on. But it seems rapid rugby's might die in a post-COVID world as well.
Yeah, that could be a casualty. Just the very international quality of it, with so many countries with different time frames coming out of the pandemic. And we're seeing that even with Argentina. We haven't mentioned the Rugby Championship, but Argentina, there's no travel in or out of the country internationally for still quite a number of months. So they're essentially could be marooned for the Rugby Championship later in the year, when again we're going to have a limited number of internationals.
Yeah. Are we going to have a Rugby Championship? Because I can't see how that's going to happen. I mean, we've got a situation here where our South African players are only just starting to return to work this week. In fact, a lot of them aren't even returning to work this week. We've got New Zealand, who now have a head start and are playing in almost like a normal rugby environment over there. And we saw the quality of their games this weekend. I mean, our players probably won't be able to start playing until probably we won't have rugby until the middle of August. And I just don't believe that it's in South Africa's interest, being world champions, to go and play in any kind of tournament at the moment where they'll be sort of seriously behind the pace, because we'll be behind the pace from you guys as well. So I don't know how you see it, Jim, and whether that's the expectation in Australia. And I know they're talking about having it in the bio bubble, but somewhere in Perth probably. But I just can't see how they can do it, because we're not all in the same place when it comes to return to play at the moment, and that's going to leave some teams, particularly ours, seriously disadvantaged.
Very true, but there's an economical imperative here. South African rugby, like Australia and New Zealand, they rely on their broadcast money so heavily, and I'm sure SuperSport will be craving international rugby with the world champion Springboks, and they just have to get them on the field. Now, how is that going to happen? I really don't know, but I can't see any touring to the Northern Hemisphere in that November slot. I think that'll be bare. So I think that'll be when some of the Southern Hemisphere matches will be played. I think in my neck of the woods, it'll be an expanded Bledisloe Cup, where New Zealand will come to Australia to play 2 tests, and we'll go to New Zealand to play 2 tests. That could be the only test rugby we play as Wallabies this year, just those 4 tests. I'd really love to have South Africa involved, but they would probably have to come, as you say, to Perth and set up there, go through the quarantine, and then be on the road and play New Zealand and Australia on our turf. But that could work. They could come in. It's just like the New Zealand Warriors in the NRL. They're in the NRL competition for the duration, but they've had to relocate from New Zealand and set up in Australia for the duration of the competition.
Yeah, I must admit, there's so many things in the air at the moment. I suppose till we have more clarity about where we are as a country in terms of COVID, and where the international travel regulations are going to be.
It doesn't sound, Brendan, though, that like sorry to interrupt, but it doesn't sound like we were on the webinar chat with Yuri Roo last week. It doesn't sound like the South Africans are that committed to it, for the reasons that I've probably outlined. It's just a feeling that the Springbok brand could take a hammering if they went and played rugby when it's premature to be playing rugby, because you've been sitting at home. I mean, our guys have been sitting at home up until today.
Well, I think the big thing is probably how overriding are the commercial sort of implications, and I think that's what comes down to for everybody. And I think the rest of the year, if you can try and ride it out, you probably will. But if you have to do it, there probably will be a way of that they'll try and find it, whether you like it or not. But I agree with you. I mean, look, it's going to be a disadvantage. It's not great for your brand if you're underdone, and it won't be a level playing field. So. Yeah, how do you get a level playing field? It's difficult at the moment. So, yeah, I don't know how
play in March next year. That's how we get a level playing field. Or as Jim says, Jim was talking about November. Maybe if we returned in August, November's realistic. It's just that September was initially the date that was being mooted. That to me is just way too early. I mean, our players will only just have returned to playing by then, if indeed they have returned to playing by then.
Yeah, and I think the big thing is the quarantine. Is do you have to? Because I mean, Yuri mentioned last week to us that you have to quarantine 14 days before leaving South Africa, and then 14 days on the other side. Now, if that's the case, that's the entire month where you can't train. The implications of that on any professional sporting team are huge. So, yeah, I suppose we have to wait and see, guys.
Are your borders open, Jim?
Borders, state borders, most state borders are coming online erratically. We've got some international travel, but yeah, it's spasmodic. So the answer is no. So we're still getting to that point.
Yeah. So we've got to overcome that. I mean, to stage a rugby championship this year, we've got to overcome that hurdle as well. And it doesn't sound like you're going to open it anytime soon either.
Yeah, but like you say, everyone's on a different timetable, which makes it so hard.
Yeah, and I still think that if there's an argument for sport, there could be, for a single sporting team or two sporting teams, there could be arrangements made with charter flights and sort of these bubble sort of environments. But you can't really. It's a lot to ask anyway in the time where there are other priorities. So I suppose we're all going to have to just wait and see on that. Other than that, Jim, I mean, is there what else going on in your neck of the woods? How are you keeping yourself busy with no rugby?
But my dog's fitter than it's ever been. A lot of walking, and golf's been available in Australia, which has been brilliant. Pretty much all the way through the lockdown in Queensland, not in Melbourne, but certainly in Queensland. So a lot of courses have been members only, so you have to be a member of a club to play, and things like only 1 to a cart. Like little pool noodles at the bottom of holes, so you weren't diving your hand into the hole. No bunker rakes, no ball washers, different things like that. No alcohol on the course. So it's been restrictive in some ways, but such a joy to be able to go and hit a golf ball. I'm not a member of a club, so I've snuck on a few times at different places, and some courses have had the availability for visitors. So I've tried to play as much as I can.
Has it helped your swing?
A little bit, but golf's one of those sports where you never get to the promised land. When the driving's working, the putting's off, and when the putting's working, you can't hit your irons. So just one of those fun games. So love it.
Yeah. I don't know if you've got anything. I'm pretty cool. I think we've covered quite a bit here.
No, I think we sort of did. We covered it, Brent.
Yeah, no, cool.
Yep, all good. All good.
Thanks, Jim. Good to see you again, man. It was really good having a chat with you, mate.
Mate, anytime if you want to do it again, anytime over the next few months, I'm always up to help you guys.